Many thanks, everybody. Just for the record, my name is indeed Bert Bedeau, and I am an employee of the Department of Cultural Affairs. The official title of my institution is the Comstock History Center. I also run the Comstock Historic District Commission, and everybody in Virginia City refers to me as either the preservation Nazi or the history commissar, depending on which newspaper you read and which political philosophy you ascribe to. So my main job is as an architectural historian, running around telling everybody what color to paint their buildings, and no, you shouldn't tear that down, and yes, you should fix that, and no, you really don't want to put that Jersey barrier up on that road, even though they went ahead and did it anyway, but that's another story. So at any rate, how might you ask, is an architectural historian going to be either qualified or interested in talking about something like the McKeen car? Well, in addition to doing architectural history, I've also been involved in railroad transportation history for quite a long time. I did a lot of work on railroad history and context when I worked for the State Historical Society in South Dakota back in the day. So I came sort of prepared to deal with railroad resources. And when they told me that I was going to get a museum with a big locomotive in it, I said, oh, cool. So I encourage you all to come up. We're located at 20 North E Street, which is at the corner of E and Union, 2 easy blocks downhill from the Bucket of Blood. So you can stop off and have a Bloody Mary and then just roll down the hill, come look at our museum. So anyway, about 2 or 3 years ago, Ron James and Peter Barton and I were sort of sitting around trying to figure out how we might be able to get some money to continue the restoration of the McKeen car that's currently going on in the shops here. And one of the things that we decided was that the artifact itself was probably eligible to be listed as a National Historic Landmark. And having come up with the wacky idea, it fell to me to actually put the documentation together. So I plunged in to doing the research on our McKeen car and getting that documentation put together, which basically means that it's done from the perspective of a historian. So I hope there aren't any bolt counters here tonight, because I couldn't tell you how many bolts are on this thing if you put a gun to my head. What I'm going to talk about is the reason why our McKeen car and McKeen cars in general are important in the national context of transportation, which is the case that you have to make to the powers that be in Washington, D.C. to get something made into a national landmark. So with that, we will segue straight into the presentation. I will try and juggle both the microphone and the zapper here, and we will head off in. And my first question is, can anybody tell me who that is? Pardon? Harriman. Close. Half a point. Half a point. That is Edward Harriman, who is the first major player and character in the discussion of the McKeen car and why it is important to anybody at this point in the early 21st century. Harriman was a financier of formidable ability, born in New York City, started in the New York Stock Exchange as a runner at the tender age of 14, and by 1870 was a member of the New York Stock Exchange, and by the middle 1880s was involved in various and sundry extremely high finance. He developed early on a reputation for taking corporations that had really not done well and putting them on a profit-making basis. He was had a reputation in New York for really being able to turn companies around, and did it with several institutions in the 1880s and 1890s. The previous to the one that we're going to talk about, probably the most prominent was his resuscitation of the Illinois Central Railroad in the 1880s. In 1893, however, he took on what may very well have been his greatest challenge, which was the Union Pacific system. Union Pacific had been built and born under scandal, and undercapitalized, underfunded, and generally corrupt for quite a long time. You may remember from your railroad history that the whole Credit Mobilier scandal with the financing for the railroad, and the accusations of public fraud and robber barons and the public be damned and all that sort of stuff. Well, the Union Pacific had limped along in a pretty bad state into the 1890s, and then the panic hit in 1893, which was a major economic downturn and depression. And the Union Pacific went into receivership, bankruptcy, and stayed there for 5 years, which is a very, very long time for any significant corporation to remain in bankruptcy court. Most people had written the Union Pacific off by 1897, 1898. And most of the major railroad corporations in the country were sitting around waiting for the inevitable fire sale and looking to pick up bits and pieces of real estate and rolling stock and anything else that wasn't nailed down. Well, into the midst of all this comes Harriman, and Harriman decides that he's going to make a go of the Union Pacific. And so he comes in 1898, buys a majority stock position in the company, and begins to operate and examine every aspect of operations on the Union Pacific to try and turn the company around and put it into profit-making mode. He spent a lot of money on the line, did a lot of upgrading, and fortunately he did inherit some fairly talented people that were associated with the Union Pacific. And probably the most important of those people, in my opinion, was William Riley McKeen Jr. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a photograph of McKeen. I still am looking for one that's digitally available. So at this point, I would segue into a picture of McKeen, but I'm going to segue into a picture of what McKeen actually built instead. And McKeen was in charge of the locomotive and car shops in Omaha, Nebraska, which was the main facility for Union Pacific for the whole system at the time that Harriman took over in 1898. McKeen was from Terre Haute, Indiana. He was a trained engineer, had graduated from the Rose Institute, which is now the Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology in Terre Haute, and also had studied at the Charlottenburg Practicum in Germany. Very highly considered railroad engineer, and had grown up literally in the Terre Haute and Indianapolis shops because his father was the president of the line. So he had railroading really in his blood. And like I said, in 1898, when Harriman took over, McKeen was working in the main shops in Omaha. And as part of Harriman's examination of operations, he very rapidly zeroed in on one of the major expense lines on the Union Pacific books, which was the need for lightly populated branch line passenger service. Now, in the 1890s, a passenger train required a steam locomotive and at least one passenger coach or car, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and at least a crew of 5 in order to be able to operate under union rules at that point. You needed a conductor, 2 brakemen, a fireman, and an engineer. And on lines out in the hinterlands of Nebraska, most of the passenger operations were losing money. And so what Harriman wanted to do was find a more economical way to operate and provide passenger service on lightly populated branch lines. And he was thinking, he basically put heads together with McKeen and said, we need to find a technological fix for this problem. And what they came up with was this. This is motor car number 1, which was fabricated by McKeen at the Union Pacific shops in Omaha in 1904-1905. It is the prototype for what later became the McKeen motor car. What they did is they pretty much applied what they did is they created a gasoline-powered motor car that could operate independently without any support vehicles or anything else, with an operating crew of 2, thereby saving 3 salaries and operating at a much better rate of return than a steam train. And so this prototype was put out in 1905 by the Omaha shops and immediately shipped all over the Harriman system. Harriman had been very successful in turning the Union Pacific around. He'd also acquired the Southern Pacific Railroad in 1901, and as a result controlled a huge railroad empire. And so this little motor car took off around the country in 1905 and was demonstrated to various operators and also to folks on the Harriman system, and eventually went into service in Nebraska. The results were that many such cars were produced and put into service on Union Pacific and Southern Pacific branch lines around the West. the reception from Harriman and from the operators of his system were such that they actually spun off a company to build and construct motor cars. And I think it was the first 6 or 7 that were actually built by Union Pacific. And then the McKeen Motor Car Company was established, and I believe that was 1906, to manufacture these motor cars, which would then be sold to not only Harriman system, but other railroads around the country, and even in one case to a railroad in Australia. They went into production in 1906 and produced, I haven't seen a firm figure yet, but I think total, depending on how you count, about 250 cars between 1906 and 1920. And this is a mock-up of their basic model. You can see that it's a self-contained unit right here, the engine right behind the motorman, baggage and express compartment here, smoking carriage, center entry right here, toilets, non-smoking compartment here, and the characteristic rounded back end and bench seat there. As they went into production, there were several things about the McKeen that were quite unique. There had been experimentation with using internal combustion engines previous to the turn of the century, but they had none of them ever gotten beyond the experimental stage in any real sense. This car was the first real application of internal combustion to rail transportation. And that's one of the reasons why they were such a significant advance in moving railroad transportation forward from steam locomotion. You can also see that it has this odd shape to it with the arched top and the smooth sides. And when we see some more photographs of it, you'll be able to see that it's got a steel skin on it. And the other really, really amazing innovation is this in the way it's constructed. It is what you call a stressed arch construction, steel arch construction. Most steel cars up until this point had been very heavy, very over-engineered. In order to save on weight and be able to make a 200 horsepower engine work to move a 70-passenger vehicle up and down the line, they had to basically come up with a light frame that was both sturdy but didn't drag the car down. And so as a result, they built this series of arched steel trusses along the body, which connected over the top, and then put a steel skin over it. And the porthole windows were a result of X-shaped reinforcing between the arches. So the arches would go like this, and there'd be one between this window, one between this window. You'd have X frames here to provide support. So you couldn't put a square window. Now you'll notice that the first prototype had regular ordinary windows in it. Well, that's because it was made of wood. This was a technology that came along after they started the initial prototype. So that's the second sort of technological innovation that this beast managed to incorporate. And the third is aerodynamic or streamline design. Now, as it turns out, the streamlining on this was exactly backwards, and it would have been much more efficient if you'd have run it this end first. But they didn't really know much about aerodynamics and streamlining in 1905, but they did come up with statistics based on some tests that were done in Germany at the turn of the century to show that a pointed prow would provide some increase in efficiency. And Harriman was such a nut for efficiency that he said, let's do it. So they put this pointy nose and rounded end on the thing in order to be able to get a little bit more operating efficiency out of the actual car. So this is the end result. This is a 70-foot. This is the 70-foot model. Now this is ours. This is the V&T engine. This was the 70th production model that came off the line in Omaha. It was ordered in late 1909 and delivered to the V&T in 1910. The Mills family that owned or had a significant part of the V&T at the turn of the century also owned a line up in Washington, in Bellingham, and they had operated one of these cars on that line in Bellingham. So Mills was familiar with the idea of a motor car. and had broached the idea to Henry Yarrington of buying a motor car in order to supplement traffic on their brand new branch line to Minden. The Minden branch, as you may recall, had been completed in the mid-1900s. An expanded line from Carson to Minden had been built in order to enhance the profitability of the V&T, which had just sold off its line going down to Tonopah just before there'd been a big gold strike in Tonopah, and so they weren't making any money on that once the Hazen cutoff was finished. So this was their new operation, and in order to be able to run supplemental service, they did have a regular passenger service, a traditional steam locomotive service to Minden, but in order to supplement that service on a daily basis and also to provide for overflow for specials and things like that, the V&T management decided that McKeen car would be just the ticket for operating. And it's possible to operate on this part of the V&T because of the relatively flat grades and the lack of significant curvature on the route between Carson City and Minden. So at any rate, an order was put in late 1909, and this 70-foot model, number 70, off the line, was delivered to the Virginian Truckee in 1910. As part of the purchase, a fellow by the name of Ed Peterson, who was the head mechanic for the V&T, was dispatched back to Omaha, and he spent a month learning how to operate this vehicle because it was substantially unlike anything that anybody who was in the railroading business had ever seen before. Obviously, he had to learn all the ins and outs of maintaining an internal combustion engine. He had to learn how to work with a fairly primitive mechanical transmission, which turned out to be the Achilles heel of these vehicles, and also had to learn the ins and outs of operating over distance, and even had to learn about an acetylene-powered lighting system, which was part of the original equipment on this vehicle. So at any rate, Peterson went back to Omaha and brought this vehicle out to Nevada in May of 1910, and it started in on regular service. This is a photograph taken at the Minden Depot on the first day of service in June of 1910. I think with a little diligence, we could probably identify who some of the people were milling around the car. But at any rate, this is what it looked like when it first went into service on the V&T. It quickly became known as the Red Dragon because it was such a strange, alien-looking device, and because it was painted a nice dark red with gold leaf trim on it. It was also assigned the number 22, motor car number 22, by the Virginian Truckee. So that's where we get the multiple numbers. Number 70 was the car body number out of McKeen. The number 22 was its operating number on the V&T roster. So the McKeen basically went into regular revenue service in 1910 and continued on into the 1920s, providing secondary service and overflow service on the Minden branch line. It evolved a bit over time. The acetylene light system was taken out. Various and sundry spotlights and running lights were put on. You can see very large additional light put on the top. You can see that somebody's affixed a bell to the top in this photograph. This was taken in Reno, and I believe this is before it was converted into an RPO, but you know, you couldn't get me to swear to it on a stack of Bibles. At any rate, it operated in its original configuration capacity pretty much through the 1920s, and then by 1929, with the advent of the Great Depression, demand for V&T passenger service really had begun to fall off due to economic downturn and also increased quality of roads and competition from road transportation, particularly automobiles. So it was laid up in 1929 and then put on standby status while the V&T management tried to get permission from the U.S. Postal Service to turn it into a railway post office. And that took quite a lot of finagling because, of course, it didn't meet any of the usual federal standards for a railway post office. But fortunately, the Mills family still had a few connections in Washington, D.C., and and Walter Folger Brown, who was the Postmaster General under Franklin Roosevelt, was prevailed upon, and it was converted into a railway post office and operated in that capacity with also limited passenger space into the 1930s. Now, it was of course, constantly under the gun because operations on the V&T were quite marginal in the 1930s, and as you may recall, the branch line to Virginia City was closed down and finally abandoned in 1938. Here you can see it where it's been converted into the RPO, and again, various modifications have been made to the deal. This was taken approximately 1940, I think. It was constantly under threat of being retired. And the only thing that really saved it was the advent of the Second World War, because once that happened, there was no alternative but to keep operating it. So it did operate through until 1945, when it was finally retired. Now, this is a photograph of the M10,000. And the M10,000 was produced by Union Pacific in the early 1930s and went into revenue service in 1934. This is the sort of the next generation successor to the McKeen car. Again, produced by Union Pacific in their shops, internal combustion engine, in this case diesel rather than gasoline, with a much more efficient transmission system. But still, the basic idea of using internal combustion was refined and put into this vehicle. Streamlining design and lightweight stressed arch steel construction, all of which were pioneered by McKeen, premiered in this vehicle in the early 1930s, and along with the Burlington Zephyr, these were the two sort of iconic early streamliners. So what I like to point out, and what I did point out in the National Landmark nomination, was that McKeen was essentially 30 years ahead of his time in working with these various approaches to railroad transportation. And as a result, if you look at the history of railroad transportation later on, from the 1930s onward, you see the transition to internal combustion, you see the transition to lightweight steel construction, and you see the transition to streamlined design beginning in the 1930s. So he really was a pioneer in looking at these various aspects of railroad transportation and technology. And that's the real significance of the McKeen car. It is very definitely a precursor to major trends in rail transportation in the 20th century. Now, you may ask what happened to the McKeen car after it was retired. And in fact, maybe we can even go back and talk about what happened to the McKeen Company before we talk about what happened to the McKeen car. The McKeen Company was dissolved in 1920. Demand for McKeen cars really fell off in the middle 19-teens. 1915, 1916, again as a result of some of the forces that really impacted the railroad business in general, the dominance of the automobile in the 20th century for transportation, and the continued difficulty in manipulating the mechanical transmission on the McKeen cars were both problems that really caused demand to fall off beginning in about 1915. Then along comes the First World War, 1917, and really no new manufacturer of rail passenger equipment is undertaken. And so in 1920, the company was dissolved. William R. McKeen made a nice little profit and retired to an avocado ranch in Montecito, California, where he lived very comfortably until he died in 1946. And you can see that this again is from about 2 years ago when we submitted the documentation. And you can see that the car body has been repaired, and the basic integrity has been put back together. The portholes have been refurbished and redone. Here's a shot of it from the rear. These are some interior photographs, and you can see that the interior finishes have really been very nicely redone. This was had just recently been put in. This is the big semicircular bench seat at the rear, and you can see the porthole design and how they flip up at the top and hook onto the ceiling to be open during operation.